Teacher friends, a new year means new podcast episodes, and I want to be creating episodes that serve you best. So I need to hear from you. Will you take 2 to 3 minutes to fill out a survey for me? You can find it at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/2025 survey. Your feedback is so valuable to me. 80% of the podcast episodes I created last year came directly from the results of this survey. So I'm telling you, I want to hear from you, and I read every single submission. And to thank you for doing this, I will select randomly 5 survey takers to win a $10 TBT gift card. All you have to do is complete the survey to be entered to win, which again, you can do at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/2025 survey. The survey closes January 31st, and the 5 random winners will be drawn and notified that day. But go ahead right now and pause this and take the survey before you forget. That's itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/2025 survey. This time of year can be hard as a teacher. You've returned from winter break, and it was not long enough for you to reset and recharge mentally. Summer break seems light years away, and you don't know how to support your own mental health, let alone your students in this time. So if any of this resonates with you at all, then I want you to get excited because today's podcast guest is for you. Let me introduce you to Dr. Hayley Watson. Dr. Watson is the founder and CEO of Open Parachute, a Tier 1 K-12 curriculum program that supports the mental health of students, teachers, and parents. She is also an author and clinical psychologist and holds a PhD in school bullying interventions, along with 4 further degrees in the field of mental health. She has been creating and delivering programs for youth and practitioners across the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia for the past 20 years. In this episode, Dr. Watson shares specific and simple, which you know we love, strategies for teachers to care for their own mental health. Both small strategies you can use on a daily basis and larger strategies you can save and apply over summer break when we get there. She also shares incredibly equipping advice for how to support the mental health of our students and to do so in a way that does not add to your own workload and all the things that you're already doing in this job. I was so encouraged by this conversation, and I really think you all will be too. So without further ado, here is my interview with Dr. Hayley Watson. This is Secondary Science Simplified, a podcast for secondary science teachers who want to engage their students and simplify their lives. I'm Rebecca Joyner from It's Not Rocket Science. As a high school science teacher turned curriculum writer, I am passionate about helping other science teachers love their jobs, serve their students, and do it all in only 40 hours a week. Are you ready to rock the time you spend in your classroom and actually have a life outside of it? You are in the right place, teacher friend. Let's get to today's episode. Hi, Dr. Watson. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks. How are you doing?
I am so excited just to have this conversation and just to have you on the podcast. I think this is such a hard time for teachers. A lot of teachers this time of year returning from their winter breaks, and they're like, do I have it in me, to finish out? And so I'm just super excited to have you on and talk about mental health for teachers and also for our students. Just such an important conversation. So I would love for you just to kick us off and just let us know what would be some words of encouragement, maybe some strategies that you have for teachers who are like, am I going to make it through the rest of this year?
Absolutely. Such a good question. And I think the first thing to really say is to acknowledge how hard this job is. This is a very challenging and very stressful job. I did a lot of kind of investigation into the research around it. And the amount of decisions that teachers have to make every single day is insane. And what that does, that stress level, because those decisions always have to be made in front of a live audience, right?
Yes.
In front of your class. You're constantly having to decide, do I do this? Do I do that? Do I say yes? Do I say no? Do I adjust? Do I not adjust? And because of that live audience, that stress on the brain, it's as intense, or it can be as intense as first responders. So first responders on the scene of an emergency, again, because our brain can't distinguish between what's an emergency stress and what's just, I'm on the spot and I have to do something. And again, everyone's brain responds differently. But I think the first thing is just to really have compassion for yourself and to know that it's okay if you're feeling burnt out and tired and overwhelmed, because it is a very stressful job. And sometimes just remembering that takes the pressure off, because sometimes we get mad at ourselves for being burnt out and we think, what's wrong with me? And I think that's the first really important piece of advice, is to just take that voice away and not listen to that voice that's giving us that hard time about it.
Yeah. And I feel like decision fatigue is so real. And
Yes.
teachers have to make 100 micro decisions a day.
Yes.
And I thought about that before, but I hadn't even thought about what you said about having the live audience, like that extra level of pressure.
Exactly.
And for high school teachers, it's not like we have 25 cutie little 6-year-olds looking at us,
No, you have people that are judging you.
Exactly. And maybe filming you, so it's exhausting.
Exactly. And then the second piece of advice is, self-reflection is so, so important with stress. And so just at this time of the year, taking stock, giving yourself that time, and this is something, again, that's really hard in this profession, to give yourself time, but just giving yourself that little bit of reflection time to say, okay, and even just writing down a list, what are all the things in this job or in my life in general that are stressing me out? What are the things that are causing me to feel this sense of overwhelm? What are the things I'm not looking forward to? All of that kind of stuff. And make an inventory. And then see if you can pick just one or two of those things to decrease or get rid of or not do or put less energy into. And it can be really hard, but I find this myself, I do this all the time. I'm taking things on, or I'm worrying about something, or I'm doing something that actually I could not do anymore. And on this, I have to do this regularly with myself. So this is, I would say, this time of year is a really good time to do it every year. And again, not beat yourself up that you have to do it again, because I have to do that. We all have to do this all the time. But just really look at, what am I doing? What can I cut out? What can I do less of? And just that, sometimes it's just taking one thing away and realizing, that was an extra burden that I didn't really need to carry right now. That can really just ease that pressure. And once you do it once, you realize you can maybe do it again and again and again. And if you kind of start that process, you find that you end up cutting out a lot of those. And sometimes it's just the way we're thinking about it. Maybe you have to do the thing still, but you can worry about it less, or you can put less pressure on the outcome for yourself. And the more you just cut and cut and cut, because your life is so full as a teacher, the more you can really get back to focusing on the things that you love about the job, and that will help you feel much more sustained.
I think that's so true. And I think I always try to encourage my audience, since they're mostly science teachers, like, we love a good experiment. So do an experiment and just try this for the next month or the next quarter, or even just the next unit you're teaching. And worst case scenario, you go back. But most likely you'll find, like you said, when you chip away at one thing, it's a lot more relieving than you anticipated.
Absolutely. I love that. And I love the concept of experiments, because often too, with things that we do for ourselves, tracking something immediately changes it for us. So if you are doing an experiment, make note of, okay, I did this differently. How do I feel? Or what was the outcome? Or note, just literally keeping track of your behaviors and what you do in a day or what you do during this experiment. The act of writing that down and tracking it sometimes literally changes it for us. We use that a lot when we're trying to quit something in psychology. If you're trying to, do something around what you're eating or your exercise or behaviors or anything like that, sometimes literally just writing down every time you do that thing, you all of a sudden notice, oh, I'm doing it less, because now I'm paying attention to do it. And that's so powerful. And that's such an incredible asset of being a science teacher, is having that brain and having that, desire to track things, because not everybody likes that.
Yeah.
So use it to your advantage.
Yeah, you should have been at my house when I took on the hobby of sourdough, because I was like, I had spreadsheets, I had data points. Like, my crunchy friends who gave me starter were like, you're crazy. I'm like, this is how a scientist approaches sourdough. Okay.
Love it.
I have a mug that says data or it didn't happen. And so I think a lot of my listeners will relate to that.
Nice.
Okay, what would you say too? Because sometimes people don't listen to these things, live. So maybe a teacher's listening to this and it's getting towards summer, or maybe we're just looking towards summer, which is our longest break. Maybe we already have the countdown on the whiteboard to when summer break is. What would be some strategies you could recommend for teachers when they have that longer recharge reset period? What would be the best ways to utilize that to really mentally prepare for the next year?
It's such a good question because what we all do naturally when we have space and time is we fill it up.
Mm.
And so, of course, being a teacher, all the things you didn't get to do over the school year, whether that's spending time with family or traveling or just housework or gardening or whatever it is, we tend to fill up our time. Or we tend to do that bounce out where we just feel so lethargic and kind of feel like and sometimes that's really important. It's important to give yourself that time if you need that downtime. But what I really recommend during that space is to carve out some time. And again, this could look different for everyone, whether it's a half a day or a weekend or a week or whatever it is. And usually doing it kind of closer to when you're starting again. So when it's coming, do your fun things, do all the things you want to do, but then have a sort of really targeted time that's just you. So this is important. It's important to be social. It's important to connect with family, but it is also really important to have time on your own, reflection time. And sometimes that doesn't feel nice. Some people love the idea of that and think, oh, I just want a weekend away by myself. That'll be amazing. Some people, that's really scary and overwhelming. So I'm one of those people. I struggled to be alone because that's when my thoughts would all come in. And so I had to practice this a lot. But the beauty of that alone time and really have it be sort of a therapeutic space for yourself. So, having quiet, having space, reflecting mostly on the why of your job in that space. Why do I do what I do? Why is this important to me? Why is this job a passion for me? Really connecting to your purpose and allowing space for all the thoughts to come up about it, because that silence and that quiet and that alone time is so important for surfacing things. You might have fears about your job or stressors about your job or things you don't like about your job that come up. And we want to give voice to those. We want to notice those and go, okay, that's interesting. Even after all this space, I'm still nervous about this thing. That's what helps us realize what we need to address. And maybe not. Maybe you think after the stress is gone, all I can think about is how passionate I am about the job. Great. So it sort of doesn't matter what happens in that time. If you're feeling panicked the whole time, if you're feeling, joyful the whole time, the point is you've given yourself a targeted space, and it can be like your ritual. Before you go back, you always do this for yourself. And it's just this sort of big check-in. I talk about little check-ins and big check-ins, and we need little check-ins periodically. And we can kind of talk about that later if you want in terms of what that looks like in this school year. But we also need these big check-ins where we're just reconnecting to ourselves, whatever's happening, whether it's a sad day or a happy day or a confused day, it doesn't matter. Giving ourselves that grace and that space in the same way we would a best friend. If a best friend was about to, start something big, we would just sit with them and chat with them and be there for them. That's what we want to do for ourselves, because so much can arise from that we haven't really realized. And that's the whole goal here. Supporting our mental health is all about self-awareness. How much can I connect to what's really happening, not what I want to be happening or, the facade I feel like I need to show the world, but what's real for me. And then from that place, therefore, I know the action I can take that will help me the most.
I think that's such an interesting idea of having this reflective check-in after you rested and recharged before you go back. Because I think my tendency is like, okay, the year's over. While it's fresh, let's look over it. But you're right. Like, you're so drained. You're going to have such a more negative lens on things as opposed to being like, let me just say goodbye to this year.
Yes.
Totally recharge. And now that I actually, I think that meme that's like, maybe you're not like stressed or depressed. Maybe you just need a nap and a snack. Like I hear it's something like that. It's like maybe you genuinely just haven't rested in 6 months. And then if you get this time, you can have a better lens on things. I want to hear more about what you were saying about the little check-ins though too, because I think that could be helpful for thinking about teachers like through the school year, just working sustainably. I feel like teachers are naturally very altruistic and it leads to so much burnout because like it's not just our job, it's our passion, it's our ministry, it's our mission. It becomes so much bigger than just a job. So how could those little check-ins help, and what would that look like?
Yes, absolutely. So this is so, so important for everyone, but especially, as you said, in jobs like teaching, where it is so all-encompassing and you give all of yourself to it. So little check-ins are really simple, but really effective. So it's literally just asking yourself, and you can do this at a certain time every day. You can also do it moments as soon, when you have a moment when one class is leaving, the other class is entering. You can kind of structure however you want. But it's asking yourself a really simple question. What am I feeling?
Mm.
And it sounds so kind of strange to ask yourself that question, or simple to ask yourself that question. But what happens throughout the day, especially in a job like teaching, where so much is happening and you just have to kind of keep going. So a student might say something that really overwhelms you or makes you feel stressed, or you're wondering, gosh, is that student okay? Or a student might say something that's rude and it hurts your feelings. Or you might come to class and you realize you're unprepared and that's stressful.
Or a parent sends you a crazy email.
Exactly. Or a colleague or whatever. There's so many things that happen. But again, live audience, you just have to keep going. You don't have the luxury of going, oh, I need to collect myself and go to the bathroom and just kind of chill out for a bit. It's not that kind of job.
Mm-mm.
And so what happens with stress is that when things occur, they impact us. That's being human, right? We're always going to feel things about our experiences. And there's no problem with that as long as we can acknowledge the feeling and then the feeling can pass. So we can notice, I felt really sad when that student said that. Okay, we've acknowledged it. We feel it in our bodies. And then feelings naturally pass. The challenge occurs when we don't acknowledge it, because then it gets buried. And then it becomes a bit like a dam. So we have all of these feelings backed up. And that's why you can get home at the end of the day and all of a sudden get this rush of feeling depressed, or rush of feeling overwhelmed, or rush of being confused and going, what's going on here? Why do I feel so drained?
Mm-hmm.
And it's because all of those feelings that really made sense in the moment have all turned into this ball of feeling. And now it doesn't make sense at all because you don't know where it's coming from. And that is where we get confused and overwhelmed. So it's really about separating each feeling as close to when it happens as you can and just acknowledging it and then moving on. So again, the more you can do that in a day, one of the things I used to do this when I started seeing clients as a psychologist, and my psychologist actually had me lay down on the floor for this. Now, I know you can't do this in teaching, but I'd shut my door. You can do this when you get home. And I would lie down on the floor and do a check-in, because for me, it was so hard to connect to my body because I was so just in my head so much. So if there's anyone listening that feels like you can relate to that feeling of just being in your head, you can do this also lying on the ground. You don't have to. You can do it just, nobody even needs to know you're doing it. You can do it internally. But lying on the ground and just going, what do I feel in my body? Really helped me, because I would start to go, oh, wow. All the stress would kind of come out of my head and be like, oh, I am carrying this in my body.
My shoulders are in my ears.
Exactly. So it's just that simple thing. What am I feeling? And then the answer can be, an emotion. It can also be a physical sensation. Oh, I'm feeling tense or tight. Or you might, if this is something that's new for you and you don't do this a lot, it's okay if you're like, I don't even know what I feel. That's perfectly fine. There's no right answer here. There's not being better or worse at this. It's just the act of asking. That's the important part, because it's training your brain to pay attention and accept the feelings that are coming up in your mind and body. And you'll notice over time, the more you do this, it has such an incredible impact on your overall stress levels and your overall burnout. Because again, everything starts making sense in your brain, and then you don't go into that spiral where you're like, whoa, why do I feel this way? This is coming out of nowhere, hitting me, out of left field.
That's so great. My personal counselor always is telling me to be curious about why I feel how I feel, and then compassionate towards myself.
Yes, beautiful.
Why does that feel hurtful?
Yeah.
Oh, of course it does, because of your story or because of this history or whatever. And then focusing on what's true. And I think for teachers, especially with we're surrounded by 30, emotional, hormonal students at one time.
Yes.
That's a lot of feelings, and it's a lot of individual people's feelings and truths, but you focusing on, okay, what is true?
Exactly.
I'm quick to like center myself. Like I'm like internalizing everything. It's my fault. I did this. And it's like, it really might be just a them problem and not a me problem. And I can just feel
Yes.
it, like you said, and then acknowledge it and let it go and not like make it a thing.
I love that. I love that. And that's why that check-in is only about how you feel. It's
Mm.
not about, who said what. It's not about who's to blame. It's not about fixing it or trying to solve it. It's just literally going, that happened. I'm feeling sad. Move on.
And I'm allowed to feel that. Yeah.
Exactly. That's the thing. It's allowing ourselves that space. And absolutely, I love that deeper reflection, which is so powerful as well, is okay, why am I feeling that way? And that whole narrative is really powerful. But you can also just do the check-in.
I like that. Yeah. It feels a little less overwhelming to not have to dig as deep.
Exactly. In a moment, you're stressed, you're overwhelmed, it's just that practice of going, there's a feeling in me right now, that's okay. And then moving on. So it's that balance of not blaming yourself for it, but then also not burying it. Because we usually do one of two things. Either we pretend it's not there, or we go into a whole drama in our head about how we shouldn't feel that way, or somebody else made me feel that way. Like, this is what we do as humans. So it is really hard. Like, again, it sounds simple, but it's really hard just to say, oh, I'm feeling anxious right now.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just going to move on. That's really challenging. It sounds simple, but it is challenging. And again, I love your idea of the experiment. Try it as an experiment.
Mm-hmm.
See what happens. I would say do it for at least a couple of weeks or a month. You want to do it for a good amount of time. And again, start small. Just do it once a day. If that's all, do it something that you can be consistent about, and then track and notice, how are you feeling? Pick the amount of times and the amount of days you can do it for, and you can sustain it. And then just notice what changed for you in that time. What did you learn about yourself? What do you feel? And you will notice that you're more connected to yourself when you do that. And that can sometimes be overwhelming, and that's okay. This is the other part to really remember with mental health and self-care, is it doesn't always feel good. And it doesn't have to feel good. Because sometimes we think of caring for ourselves and we think, oh, it's about, having a beautiful yoga class and feeling so good and empowered. And yes, that's amazing. That's an amazing form of self-care. But self-care and mental health is really about, I come back to self-awareness. The more we know ourselves, the more we know what we need. And sometimes when we start to see ourselves more clearly, we start going, oh gosh, there's things about my life that I don't like. Or I don't like the way I'm behaving in this situation, or I don't like that I feel that level of stress all the time. And that's okay. That's amazing. The first step is seeing. Once you see, then you have power. Then you can do something about it. So I think that's another really important piece is, again, be gentle with yourself. And if it's hard, that's okay. That's actually amazing, because that means there were things there that you weren't able to see, and now you can. And that's phenomenal. That's a massive step in the right direction for you and your well-being.
Yeah, I think teachers, if you're feeling like you don't have a moment to do this, I would consider protecting like the first 2 minutes of your planning, or maybe even your lunch. And instead of going to your phone and like checking in there and then getting sucked in that orbit, you check in with yourself and take
Love
like
it.
10 deep breaths, and then you start the to-do list or whatever. That time slips away from us, but it's because we lose it in things like your black hole phone,
I know. And we all do it. It's so hard.
I know.
It's so hard to do this. This is why experiments are the way to go, because you just try. Okay, let me just do it. Something small to start and see what happens.
Exactly. Okay. So just the weight that we feel as secondary teachers with our older students, like, it's not that like elementary students don't have mental health things, but it just, everything is bigger and feels heavier. And I think boundaries are harder, and we're working on our own mental health, let alone like taking on some of these burdens from our students. And they've got some heavy stuff. I mean, it just is what it is. So what would be some things you would say that we can do as the science teachers or other teachers listening to support our students, especially like not being mental health trained experts and maybe struggling with our own mental health? Like, how can we also help them without, again, absorbing, internalizing, making it all my thing?
Absolutely. It's such an important question. And it's one of the core things that I do and I'm so passionate about, because teachers are so well placed to support the mental health of their students. even not being experts. But it's really important that there's that separation drawn and that understanding of what can I do and what is not my burden and my responsibility. So in my book, I go through a bunch of different strategies, but I just wanted to share the first one here with you all, because I think it's the most important, and it's a really sort of important, again, when you're starting something, to focus on one thing. So one of the most important things you can do for your students is simply validating their feelings. So very similar to what you're doing for yourself in that check-in, where you're just noticing a feeling and letting it be there. One of the biggest challenges with teenagers is they're feeling such strong feelings, and sometimes for the first time, and they don't have that perspective yet of this will pass, or this isn't quite such a big deal. They don't have the luxury of that. And so everything feels really, really intense. And so we know we beat ourselves up about the way we feel. They are doing that even more, to a greater extent. And it feels, like you said, heavier. And so when a student is, for example, stressed about their schoolwork, or they're reacting poorly in class and they're disturbing other students, it doesn't really matter what they're doing. If you see them doing something that's unhelpful, the first thing you want to say, or one of the first things you want to say, is, I can see this is stressful for you, or I can see this is overwhelming, or I see you're bored right now, or whatever it is. Name the feeling you think they're feeling, and then say, it's okay. It's okay to feel that way. Then you can do whatever else you need to do. So for example, let's give the example of school stress. Some student is saying, I'm just so stressed about this test. Our tendency is we want to fix it. So we want to go, how can I make this better? And that's what creates the extra burden on you as a teacher, is you take it on. And so it's this not only helps them in the moment, but it creates that distance and that ownership. You can't fix it for them. You can't fix anyone's feelings. But what you can do is acknowledge, I see that this is really hard. It's normal to feel stressed about this. So it's that normalization. This is a really hard test. You're taking on a lot. This is a big deal. It's okay to feel stressed. And then pause. And it's remarkable how relieving that is for young people, but also how much just saying that gives them the space to figure out what they want to do next. So again, I won't get into kind of the next steps of how you can have the rest of that conversation, but it can almost naturally flow from there. So it's okay to feel stressed. And then simply you could follow it with, what do you think might help you with that? So you're really encouraging agency, but you're most of all saying, I see you, and it's okay to feel what you're feeling. And the same thing can apply to a student who is acting out or doing something unhelpful. And this is an important one to remember. They're also feeling something that's stressing them out or causing them, whatever, to feel overwhelmed. So even if they're doing something unhelpful, you can still set your boundary and say, we don't talk to each other like that here, or, you need to step outside, or whatever it is. But you can also say, I get why you did that. I get that you're frustrated by this topic. I get that you're bored right now. We can even turn it to a joke. It's kind of dry and boring what we're learning about,
It happens.
It happens. So you're not condoning, and this is really important, separating the behavior from the feelings. You're not condoning what they're doing, but you're saying, again, I see you. I see that you're feeling something, and that you are okay. You are acceptable the way you are. I see you, and I appreciate you, and I appreciate what you're going through. And the behavior is not okay. So it's just that validation piece that can do so much. And again, you don't need to know anything about what they're struggling with. You don't need to know anything about mental health. Again, the more you're checking in with yourself, the more this will come intuitively, because you'll go, I know how good it feels when I let myself feel something. So I'm naturally just going to say, yeah, I get it. And you can relate to it. The more you check in yourself, the more you can go, oh, wow, yeah, I know that feeling.
That's so true.
Yeah. And it's just this human interaction of, somebody a little bit older, a little bit wiser, just giving a little bit of a helping hand to someone that's just a little bit further down the mountain than them. We're all on the same journey. We're all trying to help ourselves. We can just give that little bit of guidance, and it's okay. It's okay. And that is so powerful, coming from someone that they admire and respect, and they can see is being genuine. So I'd say that is the most important piece that you can really initiate right away with all of your students.
I love that language specifically too of like, I see and then naming it. Like, I think all of us are just craving to be seen and known and loved. And so to start that first step of like, I see this.
Yes.
You are not being ignored. You're not being brushed to the side. Like, I see. I think that's really powerful. What are other things we should actively be looking for in terms of like students that you always have those students that are going to be like you said, freaking out about the test. And so it's obvious, or their expression is going to be disrespect towards you or whatever. But what about those students that maybe are a little bit quieter in that? How can we see them and make sure they're getting support and what they need?
Exactly. And it's such an important thing because so many of us in our culture bury what we're feeling. And again, we have this idea that it's going to be obvious or it's going to be, the signs. And it's important. It's important that we have training on what are those extreme signs and all those things. But the most important thing to remember is that, a lot of us people please and bury our feelings. And that's our pattern. So a lot of your students will do that. So the most important thing is to look at, do you see a pattern of behavior? Again, science teachers will love this and be naturally good at this. Is this something that occurs regularly for this student? So whether that's they never put their hand up, or they go silent anytime they're called on, or they always have their hand up and they feel like they always have to be the one that answers, or, they act silly when it gets to the end of class or anything, or, they are struggling to make friends, or they have to be best friends with everyone in the class. It doesn't really matter what the pattern is. If you see something happening all the time for someone and you can see that it might not always be in their best interest, that's it. It's just that critical thinking of going, okay, so, and it's the hardest when it's a behavior pattern that we think is positive. But okay, this student, they're my top student. I also know that they're the top student in every other class. They're also, a star athlete. Wow, this kid has no space to fail. There's, this is great. All these things are going for them, but I can see that, the only time I gave them a bad mark, they were really distressed about it, or their parent called me and complained or whatever. Like, so, okay, so this, even if it looks shiny and amazing, this pattern is not serving them. So there's a pattern, it's not serving them. And that's when they do need more support. Now, whether or not they're going to follow up on it, whether it's not your job to make sure that they do either. Of course, if it's a pattern where you're going, ooh, they're disengaging, or, something where you go, I can see this could lead to really unhelpful outcomes for them, then obviously refer them to the counselor and make sure that they have extra support. But for your own benefit, that's the only things you have to look out for. And then when it's something like that, so when it's something that's you can see is not leading to good things, so they're missing class or they're getting really stressed or anxious, one of those obvious things, then definitely make a referral. If it's a less obvious thing, this is another thing that's really important for teachers to know their empowerment with. Even if you're not making a referral, because you notice, you have a student that's a people pleaser, or you have a student that's a perfectionist, and it doesn't feel appropriate to make a referral.
Right.
You can still encourage them to look at that. And this is where that conversation can get a little deeper. And this is where, wow, I see that you do so well in this class. And again, I see that maybe you're putting a little pressure on yourself. Do you think that's fair, that you feel like you always have to be the best? And again, this can be a really short conversation, but, and you want it to be a private conversation, but just a little check-in with them. And, they might say, yeah, I know that about myself, or, oh, I've never thought about that before. And then you're just saying, it's okay. It's okay to be that way. And, it's okay if you're not always getting the best mark. So you're just giving them another perspective. You're just saying, I see this pattern. And again, the more you've seen their feelings and checked in and validated their feelings, the more safe it feels. So it doesn't feel like you're pointing a finger at them and saying, oh, you have this terrible pattern. You're just saying, I see this. If you can relate to it, it's also fine to say, I totally get that. I'm really hard on myself too. And just saying, it's okay if it's okay if you mess up sometimes, that's fine. You're just giving them this, I call it in my book, a paradigm shift. You're just saying, hey, maybe you could look at it in a different way. Maybe you could be different and that's okay. And that's such a helpful thing to do. Again, noticing what you see in your students and then giving them a few words or a referral, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be a big burden, but you're just acknowledging that something's happening and seeing if you can point them in the right direction. And the other thing that's really powerful about that is it will decrease your stress levels as a teacher. Because one of the things that we carry, and especially that you carry as secondary teachers, is that vicarious trauma. So when you see things happening, you will subconsciously know that, or consciously, whether you notice it or not, it's there and you feel the heaviness in the room. If you've done even one tiny thing that is helpful, like you've had that one little conversation, or you've pointed something out, or you've said one helpful comment, you will know that you are helping. And that means you don't carry it as much. It's this amazing thing that happens as soon as we've done something to help the situation, it doesn't weigh on us so much. So I think that's another really important piece of it.
I love that, because I think it can feel really overwhelming, all the things that are on our plates as secondary teachers, all the skills we have to teach and the tests they have to pass and the places we have to help them get in their future. But like when it comes down to it, we have the most unique job, I think, obviously, because I picked this, like to be this last kind of safe place for students to fail and learn and grow. And like you said, experience paradigm shifts before they're really launched, wherever they're launching to. And so I think this conversation is really encouraging to me and challenging to be like, what's the priority? It's the students and it's their growth as human beings. And if I need to stop grading all the things I'm grading so I have more capacity to care for people and see them, then like that matters way more.
Yes. And you'll feel way better about your job. Like that's true for all of us, right? When we're doing the thing that we know is the most impactful. And that's why you get into teaching, is to have that impact. And I think it's so important that teachers have these little tools, because you don't know where to start. And so you think, yeah, of course I want to support my students, but what do I do? And am I opening a can of worms? And it feels really overwhelming. But if you can just take these one or two little simple things and say, okay, that's all I'm going to do. I'm just going to see if I can validate my students' feelings and gently point out something that I think might be a helpful paradigm shift for them. And simple, doesn't have to take time, but it will shift how you feel about your job massively, because you start to go, wow, I know I'm making an impact. Like you're always making an impact, but you don't always know it.
Totally.
Because, it's you don't always get that feedback from students. But when you have those moments with them, something has landed, and that is so empowering for both of you.
That's so true. Well, I'm so grateful for this conversation. I want to ask you two more things before you go. One is, how can my listeners maybe keep learning from you or stay connected with you if they have more questions? Tell us about your book and those kinds of avenues where they can stay connected to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book and our resources for schools can be found at openparachuteschools.com. And so that's mental health lessons that can be taught in class, also teacher wellbeing resources. And then the book that I was referencing before is a step-by-step guide for teachers to have conversations with their students about their mental health. And it's called, I always stumble it because it's such a long title, Finding the Words, Empowering Struggling Students Through Guided Conversations. But you can find that on openparachuteschools.com. And then on LinkedIn is the place I am mainly, and just Dr. Hayley Watson. So if you want to connect to me, I love to stay connected to educators.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to link all of these things in the show notes too. So if y'all need those, you can find those in the show notes, and they'll be on my website too. So I'm excited to connect people with that. And so the last thing I have to ask you is what I ask every guest, and that's, what's one way that you have simplified your life recently?
This is such a cool question. So for me, one of the things that causes the most stress is my weird relationship to time. Everything, whenever I think about like, what am I stressed about this? It's not that I have to do things. It's that I feel like I have to do things right now or deadlines or things like that. There's really, I don't have an easy breezy relationship with time. And I am a new parent. So I have a 6-month-old daughter.
Yay.
And very, very exciting. So naturally I have less time to do my work. So one of the things that I've started doing is, it's very simple, but just not giving myself those same deadlines. And it was easier to do because I have an excuse in my head. Oh, I'm a parent now. I don't have as much time. But really, I could have done this anyway. I just didn't. But really noticing how much of my deadlines are self-imposed, how often I tell people, oh, I'll get that to you tomorrow, or I'll get that to you next week, when I didn't really have to do that. How often I book things in when I'm already overbooked. Like I do this, I have this pattern of just taking on. And so just really being conscious. And I honestly have to remind myself of this literally every day. but really not overcommitting with my time. So still, because I love doing things and I wear a lot of hats and I love that. I don't want to do less things, but I really need to make sure that I'm not putting them all in a tight time period. So it's again, really simple, a simple way for me to start saying no in a way that's gentle and I'm not really saying no. I'm just saying not right now. Let me table that for next month. And it's really just taken the pressure off. And I feel so much more joyful about my work because I don't have this constant thing of I'm not getting enough done and I should be getting more done. So I just feel like that little mental hack of how I relate to time has been really helpful and simplified my life a lot.
Listen, first, it's crazy how kids will shift your paradigm.
I know, totally.
And like, I relate to that so much because I have a little like weekly to-do list and I like would take my task and divide them by days, like the nap times I'm working.
Too. Yeah.
But one of the things I've done this past year, my like theme for the year was no rules. And so I started just taking my project plans or my tasks and putting them on one mega list. And then each day on my daily list, it's just like work on the mega list. And it's like, it's not specific. Because like you said, I'm like, I would put these things and then feel like a failure. And it's like, I'm the one who put them on the days. Like it didn't even have to be on this day.
Exactly.
It's like, I'm gaslighting myself. This is crazy.
Totally. 100%. I know. Exactly. And I love that. I use Trello. So I use Trello boards. So the same thing with lists. I know, literally, I moved from that same thing too, where it's like every day, this is what happens to like, okay, these are the things I'm working on. And just the difference in your mind of saying, I'm working on it versus I'm getting it done. And you might get it done, but it just changes everything. Again, it's one of those so simple things, but it just, changes your relationship to the project you're doing and you enjoy it more. I find I enjoy things so much more because I'm not just so focused on getting it done.
Absolutely. And I think that even what you said too about self-imposed dates can change. Like even for teachers, you can move the due date back.
Yes.
Like I think sometimes half of our stress is because we're so rushed, but it's like something I talk about all the time. I'm like, okay, like what's the worst case scenario? We don't get to the last unit. Okay.
Yes.
Maybe like 20% of our classes have like a state standardized end of course exam, but the rest it's like, yeah, we're told to do this, but like what's going to happen if they never got to this one thing? Like,
yes.
Would you rather your students remember you being like so stressed out and rushing them through everything or seeing and validating and like taking the time to learn stuff right?
Absolutely. And like, with teaching, it's so important to remember that your students, unfortunately, won't retain the knowledge.
Nope.
They don't, we don't retain that knowledge, but they will retain really important connected moments where they got something. And so if you need to slow down so that you can create more of those moments where it's an aha moment for them, that's going to serve them so much more. And again, I know that's easy to say and hard to do when you have all of these, standards you have to hit. But just even in micro ways, like how can you do that in a tiny way? How can you shift things a little bit for yourself?
Well, and maybe if anyone needs like a word for the year or a phrase for the year, no rules was the best.
I love that.
I mean, I might be doing round 2 this year because it was just so good I'm an Enneagram 1. So like I love rules and I make rules where I don't even need rules to be. So, well, seriously, thank you. This has been a delight and I can't wait for my listeners to hear from you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to connect.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode and my interview with Dr. Watson. You can connect with her and find any links mentioned in the show notes at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/episode 167. All right, teacher friends, that wraps up today's episode. If you're looking for an easy way to start simplifying your life as a secondary science teacher, head to itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/challenge to grab your classroom reset challenge. And guess what? It's totally free. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you here next week. Until then, I'll be rooting for you, teacher friend.